Hello everyone and welcome to OBooks Presents. My name is Ben Crabe and OBooks Presents is the place to discover new voices in the body, mind and spirit scene. Today we're excited to have Jane Bailey Bain, one of our authors, with us today. She's an author and creative coach. She has a degree in psychology from Oxford University and a master's in anthropology from the London School of Economics. And her approach really combines insights from psychology and anthropology. Jane has worked as a consultant on overseas development projects in Africa and Asia. During this time, she became interested in stories and how we use them in everyday life. She now runs workshops helping people to tell their own stories. And she's written 3 books. Life Works introduces archetypal figures which appear in stories from around the world. Storyworks is a handbook on storytelling for writers and speakers, and her latest book, Soulworks, which is out at the end of April in 2018, is a practical guide to creating your own life story, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, Jane.
Hello.
So I think the topic of Soulworks and creating your own life story is super interesting, and particularly your emphasis on archetypes and patterns and understanding the story of your soul on a very deep level. But for someone who is new to all this, how can you sort of sum up what Soulworks is about and how your approach in the book as an introduction?
To me, stories are really important. They're one of the key ways in which we think of ourselves as human beings, really. And one of the things that we do as we go through life is we create or construct a narrative that explains where we've been and what we've done and helps us predict what we want to do. So your life has a thread. You look at what's happened in the past. You look at how one thing has led to another. You want to explain to yourself, and also when you talk to other people, why things turned out the way that they did. But your life has a deeper story than this. This deeper story links the people, the places and the events that really matter to you. It shows how your meetings follow patterns. It shows how your actions are related to your inner values. This deeper story, your soul story, emphasizes the themes and the motifs in your life. It lets you see connections between things. It helps you to understand how early experiences have connected and linked to later ones. And this lets you see what really matters in your life story.
Yeah, and often in spiritual books or body, mind and spirit books, lots of people try and rid yourself of your story. They try and say you are not your story. But what you're saying is you're looking for a story which is actually the most profound story. And perhaps when people say you are not your story, they're talking about unhelpful, negative narratives you might have about yourself.
Yes. When people say you're not your story, they're saying that you're not limited by your past. And that's very important and very true. The danger with just throwing out your story is that we are storytelling animals. We are creatures deeply, deeply defined by story. And if you throw out your old story without being aware of what you're doing, you're just leaving an open door for some new story to install itself without you consciously being aware of it. So I think it's really dangerous to throw out something that you're functioning with without thinking about how you want to make it better. So for that reason, I think it's very, very important to be aware of what your story means to you and how what's happened in your past can connect to a brighter future.
Yeah, and I think lots of us, or everyone, if they're kind of honest, feels a bit like they are living some kind of deeper story or deeper purpose, that their life has some kind of pattern underneath, even if it's really hard to find. There is that kind of deep down, people feel that. How do go about in the book, and how do you go about in your work helping people uncover or unearth that kind of story?
One of the things that I think it would be helpful to think about before we move on to practical matters is that it might be helpful to think of your soul story as a soul song. If you think of a piece of music, there are ways in which the harmony is like the storyline, but there's also the harmonics that interact with that harmony. If you imagine your life as being a symphony, just because the first movement is dark, you don't throw it out. You build on what happened in that first movement to create something beautiful, to create something rich and meaningful. So you take the key of the piece and you can transform it from minor to major, and you use the little patterns that emerged at the beginning of the music to build up to create something truly wonderful. Now, when you listen to a piece of music, one of the really important things is that you live in the present, and that's really, really important in living your soul story. You're living in now. Now is all we have. You know, as they say, the past is a memory, the future is a dream, but the present is a gift, and that's why we call it the present. When you listen to a piece of music, you don't sit through a concert waiting for the final chord.
No.
That's not the point of listening to the music. You're existing in the moment. You're dancing to the music while it happens. And that is a key aspect of understanding, knowing that you're living your soul story. You're being true to yourself. You're experiencing now with all that's happened in the past, suddenly making sense and helping you to really appreciate this present moment where you find yourself here now, alive.
Beautiful. And running with this idea of your life, of seeing it as a piece of music or a song. That's a poetic or kind of more mystical, poetic view of life. And am I right? What you're saying is not to devalue the darker sides of that song, and not to write them off, but at the same time, when you understand the melody of the darker sides, you can help write a lighter melody. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's a lovely analogy. Imagine if you were playing on a piano or keyboard, the left hand would be playing lower notes, but they wouldn't be bad. They would actually ultimately give you the strength to support a really soaring harmonic melody.
Lovely. And this idea of your life as like a song, this is linked into what you say in the book, like you said before we get to the practicalities, that we experience life on different levels. And you know, there's an everyday physical level, there's kind of a mental, analytical level, but there's a deeper soul level. And when you're experiencing life on a deeper soul level, that's where you experience it as music or poetry.
Absolutely. You've raised a really, really important point, because we are tripartite beings. We have the physical level, which is manifest in your body, and many people mistake that with being who they are. So people will look at a group photo and they go, oh, there I am.
Yeah.
That's not them. That's a little bit of ink on paper. So we have this physical manifestation, but this physical manifestation is really, really important because it allows us to not only experience the world, but to interact with other beings. And that, to me, is the key point of incarnate existence. That's why we're here, so we can actually reach out and feel the world and touch other beings. Then there's the intellectual level, the level of the mind, and that's the way that we can consciously direct how we interact with the world. And the final level is the spiritual level, and the way that we exist on the spiritual level is, of course, we have a soul, as do other beings. And one analogy I quite like is that if this was all a car, then your body would be like the metalwork of the car. Your mind, the intellectual level, would be the fuel that can drive you in different ways. And then your soul is the driver. And that's how you decide what you want to make use of this vehicle for.
So, and what you're doing in the book is helping people get in touch with the driver. Is that?
Yes, to be aware that you can actually steer, that you don't have to live your whole life on the default settings, that you can actually customize, you can actually decide what you're going to do in your life.
Yeah. And can you say a little bit about how in the book you help us understand this language of the soul, or how you understand how we're being driven by our souls, and then how we sort of have the tools to change our direction?
Well, the first thing is to become aware that there are these 3 different levels, so that, for example, when you have a very strong, overpowering emotion, to acknowledge that emotion, which is a physical sensation. So it can be excitement or sadness or anger or enthusiasm, but to acknowledge that emotion, to name it. Because, of course, as we all know from Lord of the Rings and fairy tales and all the great mythic wisdom of our peoples, naming things gives you power over them. Then the second step is to become aware of the thoughts underlying those feelings, so that you can become aware that there's a narrative, if you like, going through your mind, and that this is producing that physical response. And that, of course, can be the difference between labeling something as really, really frightening and actually thrilling and exciting and being able to be enthusiastic about a new experience. And then once you've had those 2 levels of awareness, then the third step is to say, okay, so how does this relate to my values, to things that have happened in the past? Is there a pattern here? Am I having to have the same lesson again and again because there's something here that I need to learn, something that I haven't recognized, something that I need to see? And when you reach that level, suddenly it's like looking at a beautiful carpet on the floor and seeing the patterns and motifs and going, oh, look, it's repeated. This is something that's important to me. This is something that ties in with who I am, what I want to be, where I want to go.
So it's like, to clarify, so you're saying it's like looking first at your passionate feelings or the difficult feelings and what's coming on in and then noticing your comments and your stories, your judgments or your labels about them, becoming aware of them, and then finally placing them in a broader context in your whole life, and looking at how this pattern is repeating throughout your whole life. Can I give an example? A bit like, it could be, this is maybe a more difficult pattern, you lose a job 3 times for the same reason, or apparently the same reason, like you fall out with your boss for similar reasons, or you seem to have a boss who's just as difficult in each job or something like that, and then looking at that pattern repeating, and then sort of understanding the symbolism of that and the meaning of that, and what you're being asked to work on in experiencing that.
Absolutely. So your first feeling might be very, very upset. And then your thought might be, it's so unfair, I'm being misjudged. If they appreciated me, they would know my real worth. I must get a similar job and prove to the next lot of people that I'm actually a worthy, good person.
Yeah.
Now, so far, this is the stuff of therapy. The third level comes when you think, wait, what's happening? What should I be doing with my life? Is there something that I can take from this to create something better, something beautiful? Not just, well, maybe I should get a different kind of job, which is a starting point, but maybe I should be thinking about my life in a very different way. Perhaps instead of looking for another job, am I really being called to go and volunteer on a refugee camp somewhere? What do I need to do where, instead of just getting caught up in repeating behavior, what actually can I take from this that I can actually create something wonderful out of it? And that would be then responding to your soul story.
And you're kind of implying that there's a path out there that you actually need to be taking.
Of course, it's a very moot area, and if I could give you a simple answer, I would, Ben. I'm sure we'd all like a bright light to appear in the sky and have a moment like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. But yes, I do believe that there are times in our lives when we feel on track, when we have a deep sense of knowing that we're on the right roads.
Yeah.
And that, to me, indicates that, yes, there are things that we have, that we each have our own hand of cards, that we can play them as seems best to us, but that, yes, we each have a unique gift that we can bring to the world, and that our purpose in this life is to find what we should be doing and to do it.
Yeah. And in the book Soulworks, you're kind of teaching people to get in touch with that path and understand that path.
Yes, it's a book with it's a practical guide book. It's a handbook for people on a journey. And so there are a lot of exercises that help you think about what's happened to you, get in touch with your inner values, your inner compass, if you like, and then plan out in a very practical sense a chart or a map for creating the kind of life that you want to have. To live the life that you want, you have to be the kind of person who could live that life. So there will be times when you've got to really change things and go out on a limb. But it's perfectly possible if you just do it step by step. There's an old Chinese proverb that the longest journey starts with the first step.
Yeah, and it's about just taking that step. This resonates with me, and I think it will resonate with everyone because what you're talking about is about something very deep, kind of deep truth in people. But you say, if someone's listening to this and they say, yes, I need to get in touch. I know I'm not on the right path, and I need to find my way out of this wilderness I'm at. Can you give me an example of the kind of practical exercises that you offer in the book that once done in completion start to make that picture?
Well, a very simple place to start is literally charting your territory. So you could, if you're in that place, then start with a map of that place. Take a big piece of paper and in the bottom left-hand corner, draw your house, something to symbolize where you work, something to symbolize the important people in your life, and put it all down on paper. And then on another bit of the paper, maybe right up in the center, draw what your ideal house would look like and think, well, where would that be? If I'm in the city, would it be in the countryside? Would it even be in this country? What would my ideal place of work be in relation to this? How would I get around? So you could draw a bicycle, trees. Which of the people that were in my original corner do I want to bring up here with me? And once you've got a picture of it, then you can sketch a little line connecting the two and think, well, this is a road. And actually, the impossible dream isn't impossible at all. I can connect these. Starting from here, how do I get to where I want to go?
So it's like naming it, like you said before, the poem.
Naming it, drawing it, creating it in reality. There's a wonderful word to reify, which means to make something concrete or real. And that's very, very important. Once you can actually picture where you want to go, then you can start to move your life in that direction. Having done that initial exercise, for example, you might start looking through magazines for pictures that represent that ideal life and stick them up around your house. Things to help you start moving in that direction. And of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but start with little steps, and in a year's time, you could be somewhere quite different from where you are today.
And there's a famous quote, I've forgotten who said it, that act of naming and committing, then once you make that commitment, the universe almost conspires to help open the way for you.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful book by the authoress Ursula Le Guin, whose father was actually an anthropologist, called The Wizard of Earthsea, and that's all about the power of naming and how that helps us to control forces both light and dark. And I really want to emphasize that when we talk of dark forces, we're not talking about bad. Light and dark are the necessary counterparts of each other. You have to have both light and dark in order to make sense of life. And in a way, we have to learn to call on the darker powers in order to create something good. If you think about it, if you want to have white light, You need all the colours of the rainbow.
Yeah. And so you'd agree we're all a mixture of light and dark, and there's no point trying to shut one out.
Not only no point, but we disempower ourselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we talk about archetypal figures, which is one of the things I've written about in my earlier books, people say, oh, well, I don't want to be a dark archetype, I want to be a good archetype. And I say, well, for example, supposing you have the power of the ogre. If you're an environmental activist, it's no good saying, oh, I wish we didn't have plastic bottles in the ocean. What you have to say is we're going to enact legislation that ensures that anyone that pollutes the river is fined. That's taking the power of the ogre and doing good.
Yeah, I love that example. Yeah, if you're going to be an environmental activist, you somehow have to call on or become or channel the power of the ogre or be, Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned archetypes. Archetypes is one of my favourite subjects and a beautiful way to describe the language of the soul. And how do you talk about archetypes? Well, can you explain to maybe someone who's not familiar with them how you understand them to be, and how in your book how you're using archetypes in terms of writing your own soul story and choosing the path that you want to take?
Archetypes are universal figures which appear in stories from different times and places around the world, and you recognize them as soon as you come across them in a story. The hero sets out on a journey and he meets a wise mentor who gives him advice. You know at once that if he doesn't follow this advice, he's going to regret it. The mentor reflects on one level his future self, the person that he will evolve into at the end of his heroic journey. So these archetypal figures are very useful for us when telling stories because we have expectations, they help us to analyse the world. They're also key for understanding ourselves. The psychologist Carl Jung talked about archetypes as a concept, saying that they existed in the universal subconscious, that they precede thought as outline forms. We colour them in on the basis of our individual experience. So your image of a good mother will be influenced by the mothering you've had from a parent, a teacher, a nurse. And so this is how we actually conceptualize the archetypes, but they're very, very deep inside us. They're all of them inside all of us. We can all be any figure that we want. So I can be a hero, you can mother a friend. They're all very, very key to all of us. So I've devised a schema whereby I look at the anima and the animus, what you might call the masculine and the feminine parts of each of us, and look at the light and the dark aspects of both of those. So that's how I use them in my work.
I see. And so what you're saying is, if someone's the archetype or the principle of mothering or being a mother is almost primordial there in all of us, but our own specific way we experience it will be depending on who looked after us, possibly to do with our family or our family history or other reasons, our environment, other reasons, and
Exactly. And then when we meet new people, we project our archetypal figures onto them. Of course, everyone is really a complex individual, but what we do in terms of telling our own story is we project these figures, so that someone might say, oh, my headmaster at school was a very difficult trickster figure. Well, that's one aspect, but if that helps that person make sense of their story, that's what they do. Once we become aware that we're doing it, of course, then we can either use that in a positive way or discard anything that's not useful to us in the future.
I see. And in the book, kind of what you're doing is getting people to write their own story. Is that right?
Yes, to create their own story, to look at what has happened in the past in terms of the places and the people and the events that were significant to them, to decide what they want to be part of their future, and then creating this picture of where they're going and helping them to move there.
And which archetypes are going to illumine that story or play a part in that story?
Yes, to become aware of how those archetypal figures are. influencing them.
Fantastic. And how did this become your passion? How did you find your way to coaching people through this and working with this particular way of working?
I'm fascinated by stories. I worked for some years as an advisor on development projects in countries around the world, particularly in Asia, and became very interested in how people use stories both to communicate and to make sense of their lives. We use stories all the time. We share experience with stories, so that if, for example, I say to you, I burnt my hand on the kettle this morning, I'm making a causal link of events that when I touched the kettle, it hurt my hand because it was hot, and I'm conveying that causal link of events to you, so you don't have to go around touching hot kettles and being hurt. You can learn from my experience. So we use stories all the time to communicate with other people. We're always chattering away and telling each other stories. I became interested in how we put a shape on our experience in this way and how this affects what we think is possible for the future. So I started by helping people formulate their stories in a way that would be helpful for them, constructive to them. For example, we talked before about applying for jobs. If you're applying for a new job, it's helpful to tell your story in a way that shows what you've done and how it can be relevant to what you want to do next.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I realized that people do this all the time in their personal lives. They tell themselves stories that can be limiting, but can also be empowering. And it's how do you get your stories to be empowering?
And do you work as a coach with people one-on-one in this way, or how do you normally work?
I run a lot of workshops. You can work one-on-one, but I also love running workshops where people can share stories and help each other to create their stories. That's extremely interesting. You can use stories to help people in other ways too. For example, I recently ran a workshop in Tunisia with a charity that's helping to encourage ecotourism, getting the elders of a tribe to share their stories so that we know how the traditional way of life can be kept alive. And that's a really, really wonderful thing to be involved with.
That sounds amazing. And I think what the benefit of your approach, and because personally, you can say, you can reframe a statement about yourself and say, I'm a not very nice person to I'm a nice person, but working the way you're working with these deep sort of mythopoetic stories, archetypes, kind of the language of depth psychology. To me, it goes very deep. It speaks on that soul level, and it goes very deep down than a simple sort of surface level, almost logical statement. Would you agree?
Myths are stories that have survived the test of time. It's very Darwinian. A story only survives if it's told again. So if you tell me a story and it touches me and I repeat it to someone else, that story has survived. To me, to call something a myth is the greatest compliment of all. It means it's true on a level that's so deep that it's touched people for tens, hundreds, maybe thousands of years and mattered to them.
Wow, lovely. A myth is the greatest compliment. I like that. And so the book is coming out at the end of April. And if people want to know more, if people are interested in creating their story, going deep like this, working with archetypes, running some of the exercise or workshops, where can they find you? Where can we get in touch with you? And is there anything you're particularly up to at the moment?
There is. I have a Facebook author page. I have a website, janebaileybain.com. For people who want to do this kind of work, the book is enough. There are a lot of exercises that you can do either on your own or working with someone else. And so for a number of the exercises, they'll work equally well, depending on what you yourself feel is the best way for you to work. So you can do it in pairs or just individually. This is a journey that you have to take alone, but you can take it knowing that other people have been on a similar path. So the path is always going to be a path that you have to take as an individual, but as you look around you, it's like walking through a woods and seeing other little lights in the wood as people make their own way through the trees and the brambles and undergrowth. And you know there are other people working on their stories too.
That's lovely. So you're taking the journey alone, but we're all walking together on our journeys alone.
Sounds a bit like High School Musical.
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
Yeah, right. I think that's lovely. I think that's a lovely way to finish up. And thank you for coming on. I think this is a really profound and creative and fun way of investigating oneself and exploring oneself, and also an empowering way that goes right to the nub of things. So check out the book Soul Works, out at the end of April, and thank you so much for coming on, Jane.
Thank you.